Dr. Beal's district are going to get the opportunity to choose between good and evil, and that's Pat Bauer. Keep politics out of this, but I also said we keep Christ in it. And what we heard is a man that's enlivened and enriched and enlightened by God's grace. And that's what we need leading Indiana in that district. Dr. Wayne Beals. Next, we have Micah Clark of the American Family Association. Micah.
Thank you, Peter. I've been stayed out now for 20 years. Believe it or not, working down there, and Dr. Beals, that's half the time your opponent has been down there. You've been out there 40 years. And having been down there, I can say this, in my 20 years, I've never heard Pat Bauer give a speech as good as you do, so enjoy it. And by the way, because of that, Peter, I'll never forgive you for making you speak after those two guys. I just want to share my heart for that reason, because I'm not a great public speaker. We all have different gifts. But there's some things that I've had on my heart for a while, and I think I'd like to set the stage before the pastors come up, because that way the public policy guy can do it and take the weight off his shoulders. I want to make the point. I have a hero in the Bible, many, of course, but one of them is John the Baptist. And the reason I like John the Baptist so much is because John the Baptist is one of those guys who started his calling and finished his calling strong. And not to get off track here, you know, one of the things that concerns me as a father and in our culture today and the Christian community is the reality is most people who start the Christian faith don't finish very strong. You know, you look at David, for example, unfortunately. The blessing is it doesn't really matter how you start. What matters is how you finish. Amen. And that's why I admire Joseph so much. You know, here's a guy who's on track, who didn't fall short. John the Baptist is that way too. But you know, when you hear a sermon on John the Baptist, typically in church, it's about the voice in the wilderness, the man who proclaimed Christ. And of course, he did that so well. You know, when his disciples came to him and they asked him about his cousin who was drawing a crowd. And John the Baptist, what did he say? He said, I must decrease that he may increase. Now there's a difference in spiritual leaders, I think, sometimes today. It's another topic. But you know, you often hear sermons about him on that. Or you'll touch about, you know, this guy who lived in the wilderness and ate locusts and wore, you know, bear's clothes or whatever. And, you know, this rough guy. The thing you don't hear so much about is why John the Baptist died. You know, John the Baptist died because he got in the king's face and said, you're with a woman who's not your wife. He got thrown in jail and he lost his head because of it. In my view of Christ, and pastors, correct me if I'm wrong, I cannot find anywhere in Scripture where Jesus ever excuses sin or fails to point it out. Now, he's perfect, so he points it out better than we do quite often. He does it perfectly. But my assumption is I don't see anywhere where he ignores sin or doesn't handle it properly. Now, that's important because I'm kind of taking a little bit of liberty with this story. But if you remember, I think it's in Matthew chapter 11, when news of John the Baptist dies reaches Jesus, he's talking to a crowd, and he says, never has, and when he learns of this, he says, never has there been a man born of a woman better than John the Baptist. Now, I think that had John the Baptist blown his testimony, deviated from his mission, I think Jesus would have said something. Now, I am not saying that being involved in politics will make you better than any man born of a woman like John the Baptist. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is if you are called to be politically involved, don't let anyone say that that is a lesser calling than perhaps being a missionary like Jackie was, working for Habitat for Humanity, or helping the local crisis pregnancy center. There is nothing wrong with political calling or a calling in your life that makes you politically active. And what I'm concerned about is that many churches today have this either-or attitude. You know, it's the Great Commission, it's sharing the gospel or politics. No, it's not. It's both.
That's right.
The Great Commission is the most important thing. We should always remember that. But what concerns me today about the culture is that we have this view among many churches that, well, we will change the culture if we win people to the Lord. What I am observing is we're not winning people to the Lord fast enough to change the culture. If we're not politically involved, the culture is going to shut us up because that's their goal. So it's not an either-or. It's both. We have to be both. That's how I view my role at the legislature, as the voice of the legislature with the American Family Association, is trying to keep the wolves at bay while people at church and pastors and people living out Christ in their workplace and where they're called to can change lives the way that only the gospel can do. Now, in the Capitol building, and John, I know you've seen this, and you'll remember exactly where it is. There's a phenomenal statue. Well, like so many things in Washington that have our history in it, I expect as millions of people go through these great, the great things in the city, 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 even know what it's about. So there's a statue there of a man by the name of Peter Muhlenberg, John Peter Muhlenberg. He's holding a robe in one arm, kind of draped over his side, and I think a Bible in the other. I'm not sure. I mean, that's not really important. What's unique is that he's holding this robe. And the story of John Muhlenberg is that he was a legislator from the state of Virginia. In 1776, on January 21st, he comes back from the legislature to preach his farewell sermon because he was also a pastor. Not very uncommon. It was pretty common. In fact, his brother was a pastor also. I think it's John Frederick Muhlenberg in New York. We'll get to him in a second. But Peter Muhlenberg gave this sermon based on Ecclesiastes chapter 3. You've heard it. Unfortunately, we should know it because of the Bible. We probably know it because of the 60s song. To everything there's a season, turn. Anyway, so many. That's the passage he's talking about. To everything there's a season. To everything there's a season. When he got to that point where he said there's a time of peace and a time of war, he slipped off his pastoral robe, and beneath it was the uniform of the Continental Army. Outside the church, he had drummers lined up. They began to play the drums as he walked to the back, and 300 people left the congregation, 300 men. He signed them up that day, became the 8th Regiment, Virginia Regiment, to fight the Colonial War from his church. It's a great example of the calling we have today, because today we have a culture war going on. And it's the pastors who need to say, I'm going to take off my robe and I'm going to fight this culture war. And my congregation needs to step up and live out Christ and fight the culture war. We have a culture war right here. You folks know this better than I. New Paris Elementary, it's been referenced a couple times today. And I can't add a whole lot to what's going on. The ACLU is suing to prevent a Bible class, which is something going on in thousands of schools across the nation. It's not that unusual. As I read the news story, it was funny. I almost laughed at it when I read it because the parent who is suing, and correct me if I'm wrong, she's upset because her son, I think it is, was given a slip to opt out of the Bible class. And what I read from the newspaper was she's upset because most of the kids are going to the Bible study class and learning about the Bible as literature and according to the law. But she's upset because her student is just doing nothing or studying hall or something. And that's one of her complaints. Well, the reason that's so funny is that for 20 years and beyond, when it was the 20 years since I've been doing this, we've had statute on the books that say that abstinence education, sex education, is supposed to teach abstinence until marriage. In most public schools, it doesn't. They kind of mock it, they laugh at it, it's in the books. They spend one sentence on that and they say, okay, let me tell you how to use contraceptives. My parent comes in, whatever. Well, over the course of many years, I get calls from parents who say, hey, I just found out my son was taken into class and taught something about contraceptives, it goes against my values. I said, well, we have this statute where you can opt out. And I've worked with hundreds of parents who've taken the copy of the law to their school board, to the principal, and say, I want to opt my child out. I don't want this. I'll teach them this. Of the hundreds or so cases in 20 years, I've never had one school say, okay, well, while he's out of class, we'll teach you algebra. They say, no, go sit and study. Well, you can opt out, but you're going to sit there and you're going to read a book, you're going to do whatever. And this parent now is somehow upset that her child is missing out because he is. But well, that's happened to us for years. And we're content with it. I just want my child out of there. But, it's so often is the case, the ACLU wants to not just protect this child from the Bible, they want to take it completely out of school. And it's amazing because here's what happens. I have two examples. An example of opting out of sex education, go and sit in another room. If that were my child, it's fine. I just don't want them to hear that. Well, she wants to change the whole school. And what I've found with Christians, I'm not saying we should go try and take out sex education, although it wouldn't be bad, especially since we have state law saying this is what sex education should be. But the point is, we give up more of our rights than we lose. And we're so timid sometimes. Here's this one person using the ACLU to try and completely change the entire school system where most people are probably perfectly fine with the Bible class. And here we're just happy to opt out of sex ed and get our child out while the rest of the kids are being poisoned. And I want to ask, why? Why are we as Christians so quiet? I think there's a reason. We've been conditioned that way. We've been conditioned by the culture. We've been conditioned by threats, by fears. I want to talk just for a second about what churches can and can't do election time. But in case I forget this new parish situation, I was looking at something. Dr. Benjamin Rush. For some reason, now John, you may know this, I don't know, I couldn't find why Dr. Benjamin Rush is called the father of public education. He's actually a doctor. He wrote some textbooks. He was one of the youngest signers of the Declaration. He wrote one of the first chemistry textbooks used in America and one of the first mental health books used on diseases of the mind. So that might be why, or there might be another reason I didn't have time to look up why he's called the father of public education. Maybe it was something he did as a founder. But he wrote this. He wrote a paper about the defense of the Bible. And I pulled two quotes of it that I thought were amazing. It said, the only means of establishing and perpetuating our republican forms of government is the universal education of our youth in the principles of Christianity by means of the Bible. He goes on to say this. The Bible, when not read in schools, is seldom read in any subsequent period of life. The Bible should be read in our nation's schools in preference to all other books because it contains the greatest portion of that kind of knowledge which is calculated to produce private and public happiness. Now, you talk about being 180 degrees of what you're reading in the paper about New Paris Elementary. Here's a founder saying, hey, without doing this, we're in trouble. And we are in trouble. You've seen it. I can tell you the stories. I can tell you the story of the culture. You know it. Now let me give you another example real quick. Well, I'll move on. Let me touch on what pastors can do because this is something you should take away. What I've found is that a lot of pastors and churches, and I'm not picking on pastors at all, is that there's a hesitancy to do what we're allowed to do, and partly because the culture has conditioned us to be afraid. If you're in a large church, and perhaps even a small one if it's well known, quite often, before election time, right about now, churches will receive a letter from the People's American Way or the ACLU saying, if you talk about politics, you'll lose your tax exempt status. I've seen the letters. They come out every year. Barry Lynn sends these things out. And churches are getting more and more afraid because of that to do this. What's interesting is in 1954, a man by the name of Baines Johnson, perhaps you've heard of him, ran for Senate in Texas. He got upset with a group kind of like AFA, a nonprofit group, not a church, but nonprofit 501c3, that endorsed his opponent. So when he was elected, he slipped in this little line into the IRS code that said 501c3 nonprofits could not endorse. It included churches. Although I don't know if that's what he wanted, but it was applied to include churches.